I feel like Rittenhouse is pretty cut and dry a lot of different ways, but I still hear people get a lot of the kind of like facts or analysis, in my opinion, like really wrong. So I think the thing I want to talk to you about is there's like 3 main points that I'll see if I can move you on any of them. Number 1 is I think that the riots in Kenosha were literally propagated by fake news. They should have never happened. I think that Rittenhouse had just as much reason to be in Kenosha as any other person that was there. I think that all of the Rittenhouse killings, or the 2 and then the 1 shooting the guy's bicep, were all in self-defense and had nothing to do with defending property. These are 3 points that I see repeated the opposite way by left-leaning mainstream and alternative media over and over and over again. I think that all 3 are like clearly wrong.
Okay. I mean, the first one in terms of you don't agree with the Kenosha protest seems to me to be, I mean, largely irrelevant in terms of Rittenhouse, in my estimation. I mean, I don't want to litigate whether people should have been upset and should be upset about policing in this country relative to black people in particular.
See, and this is such dishonest framing.
You're right.
Because it's like, yeah, you can be upset. You can't go out and burn down your neighbor's business because you're angry. Just come out and say it. There's a giant difference between being upset and seeking change through the normal political process and engaging in political violence. Giant difference.
Yeah. Well, and also if you caught it, he didn't say about Jacob Blake. He immediately pivoted to the broader discussion.
Yes.
Of, black people being wrongly killed by or shot, in this case, by the police. And I would guess that the reason he immediately tried to pivot away from Jacob Blake is because he knows that Jacob Blake was completely justified what the police did, even though he originally was parroting the narrative on his show.
Yeah, I will go even further than that. He knows that the claim that Destiny is making, he is somewhat responsible for.
Right.
Yeah.
Or at least maybe not personally, but that he's part of the apparatus which pushes this kind of narrative, which gets people riled up.
Personally responsible for. I'm certain of it. He did stories on Jacob Blake. He drank the Kool-Aid on Jacob Blake. He did.
Right.
Look, I would not be able to sleep at night if you and I did a show making up a bunch of, going after some commie kid, right? That, it turns out was totally innocent and we were fucking lying about.
Right. And then led to like a riot or some kind of violence. Yeah.
Yes. Accuse people of things that they never did. Yeah, because you and I both have this thing called a conscience, and we would not like it if somebody did that to us, or our family or friends or any of that. I mean, you got to be in a situation where you're so concerned about protecting your own reputation over somebody else's life.
Well,
to be in the situation Sam Seder is in.
The problem is not that Sam Seder doesn't have a conscience. The problem is that he's so head first in the bucket of tribalism that he doesn't I bet he wouldn't admit this publicly, but this is my prediction here, since he's making all sorts of predictions about Kyle, is that even if you could get him to admit that Jacob Blake was a rightful or justified shooting from the police, he would still hand wave that away and say, well, the majority of times the police shoot or arrest or hurt a black person, it's unjustified. And so that's why he's trying to downplay it. So in his own mind, he's creating a rational justification for all of this.
It's still sickening. Like
you can say,
listen, would you condone a criminal justice system? And we do this in America. We err on the side of we would rather let, 10 guilty people go than put an innocent man in jail. Mm-hmm. You're basically advocating for a system where, we get a couple innocent guys in jail and that's okay. That's what he's advocating for.
Right.
You have to press him on that.
Particular.
Well,
I mean, that to me is, and you can argue that the Kenosha, protests were set off by, Blake's killing.
Blake's shooting, right?
Shooting, sorry, and I guess he's paralyzed. And you could argue that it was just that, without any of the context of the protests that have been going on across the country and the building, literally decades. I mean, I would tell this story for years on my show when I was in.
He's about to go on this completely pointless story, but the important thing here is that this is such a bullshit talking point, because it's like, yeah, if Jacob Blake got shot and George Floyd situation hadn't happened, there probably wouldn't have been a riot.
There definitely wouldn't have been a riot.
Right. But that's irrelevant. If the news didn't lie about Jacob Blake, then there definitely wouldn't have been a riot either. So. Yeah.
Great point.
Straight Entertainment, I did a sitcom called The Show. And it was a white head writer on an all-black variety show. And one of the guys I worked with was a guy named Chris Spencer. And Chris, we went back to his house at a break during shooting or rehearsal or whatever it was. And we pull into his garage in West Hollywood. And we get followed as we come in by his buddy in a Range Rover. And at that time, that was like if you were successful in LA, you had a Range Rover. And this was in the mid 90s. And the guy comes in, he's like, "Thank God you were there. I was being followed by the cops again for the 4th time this week, because they pulled me over 3 times to check and see if this was my car." And he said he had called the police department and spoke to a sergeant. It was like, "Is there a sticker I can get that says this is my car?" And the cop said, "Are you black?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, "There's really nothing I can do for you." And so, I mean.
And that makes it okay to put an innocent kid in jail. Like, what the fuck? This is so unrelated.
Well, I mean, listen, because 30 years ago.
Right. Yeah. And that's another thing.
Right.
Things haven't changed in 30 years. I mean, I got my New Orleans stories too, but hopefully things have changed.
Because 30 years ago in LA, his friend was harassed by racist cops or profiled because he was black.
Right.
Somehow that justifies the news spreading fake information about Jacob Blake, stupid people buying that fake information about Jacob Blake, and then, rioting and destroying, their city.
Right.
That makes sense. Yeah, sure. Okay, Sam.
Quite the justification.
Right.
This has been going on, well, far before that, but certainly, at least in terms of our lifetime, has been going on and on. So I think you can say people should not have been upset by the shooting of Blake, and that was the only reason why they protested, and they protested on false grounds. But I mean, I don't even think that's worth litigating. People can make their own determination as to whether those protests were justified.
Okay, so
if the Jacob Blake situation was different and he was wrongfully shot, I can almost guarantee you that this would not be his position. He wouldn't say, "Well, it's irrelevant."
Yeah,
he'd be bringing up in every debate. He's like, "Oh, man, innocent black man was just killed by the police, or was just paralyzed by the police destiny. How can you defend this?"
He's not bringing it up about George Floyd.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Of course.
All right.
Or go ahead.
As far as the second one that you said was,
can we move through them one at a time, I think, and then
sure.
Yeah. So on the first one, so when I'm thinking of like how I want to deal with a particular thing, I usually try to think of like, well, what happens on the other side? I want to be able to. Have you heard of the term stochastic terrorism? It's like this idea that like if you give enough of a certain type of rhetoric, even if you don't directly call people to violence, it's probably going to be some violence that happens. So I would say like Tucker Carlson, when he talks about the Great Replacement over and over and over and over again. And then
I think this is part of what starts to trigger Sam, because look at the way he's reacting to this. Look at his face. Because he's like, he's like stroking his beard. He's like, is destiny accusing me of stochastic terrorism? Like he's starting to get like,
You're right. You're totally right. He said the word, and
yeah.
Sam Seder's 100% guilty of stochastic terrorism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then when some kid starts killing black people or like immigrants or whatever, it's pretty obvious that like, even if I can't draw a straight line from A to B, I can see how somebody could get from A to B. So I want to be able to condemn people on the right when they give irresponsible rhetoric that leads to things like shootings or things like the January 6th attempted coup insurrection. I want to be able to say, when you engage in this type of rhetoric or language, it's dangerous and it will cause people to do this. So I think for Kenosha, I wouldn't say that like an amalgamation of things led to those riots. I would say pretty clearly it was absolutely the coverage of the Jacob Blake shooting. Jacob Blake was shot on August 23rd. There were riots that day and on the 24th, and on the 25th was the Rittenhouse shooting. That timeline of like 3 days is not an accident. It was very clearly, the video went out of Jacob Blake being shot. Every left-leaning media person in the world jumped on it, started blasting it all over Twitter, all over social media, all over mainstream media as like a poor innocent black guy that got shot in the back by cops 6 times. A lot of people still think he was killed even. I think that the misreporting and the mishandling of that was absolutely the biggest drive of those Kenosha riots that happened in the following days.
I mean, you may have a point. I don't know. To be honest with you, I mean, I wouldn't know how to parse that out.
That's such a dipshit answer. This is
I
so
wouldn't know how to parse that out.
This is such a dipshit answer. Of course you know. Of course you know. What the hell?
How do I parse that out? I just don't
Does he not understand the entire George Floyd situation, that there was a video and everyone got upset about the video, and like if the video didn't exist, there probably wouldn't be any like riots, and like, come on, Sam, you're in media. You understand the situation. The first thing I heard of Jacob Blake was he was at a birthday party with his kids and the cops showed up and blew him away.
I don't know how to parse that out, Adam.
It's so simple. This is what it's infuriating when somebody is so caught with their hand in the cookie jar that they have to make all these like backwards. Oh, you know, it's up to the people to decide. I can't make that decision for them. No, you know the truth. You know the truth. Turn your brain on.
And you can say that the coverage was poor, and that, in my mind, is in no way a mitigating factor in my mind for the actions that Rittenhouse took. So it's sort of irrelevant relative to my perception of Rittenhouse. I mean,
okay. Oh God, those actions are totally irrelevant, but Rittenhouse showing up with a gun is completely relevant to the chain of events that took place.
I know.
It's like of course he can't go back to there, because if he goes back to the irresponsible reporting, then he has to admit, oh, I was a part of that irresponsible reporting, and that irresponsible reporting was the thing that made this kid pick up a gun and go there, that I've been chastising him for doing it.
Yeah, exactly.
Destiny's doing such a good job of placing Sam Seder in the causal chain of this thing.
Right.
Like, you're literally ripping on a kid that you are responsible for sending there.
Yeah.
I take it as a granted that at any given time, news is sensationalistic, and the way that our media is organized now, it's sensationalistic, depending on who they perceive their audience to be, and et cetera, et cetera.
Whataboutism, totally.
Well, that's not even, it's just like this gross justification of, well, the news is sensationalistic, so therefore it's okay for them to lie about Jacob Blake and cause a riot.
He is strongly implying, though, and the only reason he's bringing it up compared to who your audience is so he can say, oh, the Republicans do this too. The Republicans make up shit and do sensationalistic things. Yeah. That's the only reason he's bringing it up.
I mean, there were protests, peaceful protests in that first day. at night, things turned ugly, and maybe it is the media's fault or certain media.
I like when Sam is, in his safe space of the Majority Report with his.
It's all fucking lies. Yeah, exactly.
Right. It's all like Kyle didn't even know what the threat was. He didn't even know if there was a threat. He didn't know. Yeah. And now he's like, well, after the first night, I'll admit things did get pretty crazy.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Now all of a sudden, Kyle totally has a reason to go there.
Right. Now suddenly Sam seems to be aware that there was actually danger and threat posed by rioters that night. He seems totally aware. He wasn't aware of it on his own show, but when he is talking to someone who can challenge him, suddenly he has knowledge about the situation.
Isn't it weird how that works?
Yeah, very strange.